Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, What is SGE and How to Prepare Your Business for It. We are so glad that you took some time out of your morning to join us. As a quick introduction for everyone who may not know us, I'm Andrea, and with me, of course, is Matthew. We are business partners at Elementive, where we specialize in tech SEO. We have worked together for over 14 years and are very grateful and humbled to get to celebrate 10 years as partners at Elementive this year. A few notes for the webinar today. We do have time at the end for any questions, so please feel free to drop those in chat and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. We will also be recording the webinar and we'll send it out later this week. So if you want to revisit any of the content or just need to duck out early for a meeting or something, look for that in your inbox later this week. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad you're here. And with that, Matthew, I will let you jump right in.
Hello, thanks for joining us, everybody. Let's dive right in, talking about what SGE is and how this is going to change the world of SEO. So start off with SGE stands for Search Generative Experience. And Search Generative Experience is the way Google refers to integrating generative AI into their search results. So a lot of you probably have already seen it, have already been experimenting with it, but for any of you who haven't seen it yet, this is what it looks like. So what Google is doing is they are using a generative AI system like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, any of those systems, and they're generating a response to that search query, and then they're placing that above the traditional search results. And they all look a little bit different. There's a few different formats, a few different ways that these can be constructed, but typically they have some kind of paragraph, they have a bullet list of information, some have tables, some have images, and a few have links. So in this case, you can see those two links are in here in those blue boxes. And then at the bottom, there's the follow-up questions. You can converse with this. So it's a very different experience than what you get out of a traditional search result. And Google's not the only one doing this. Bing is experimenting with this as well, using Copilot to respond to search queries. In Copilot's case, they're really putting the emphasis on the text. There's usually more text with Copilot than there is with Google's SGE, and the links are really buried. You can see in this case that the links are way down at the bottom of the screen in those learn more links, and they're really small. They're kind of buried. They're not given as much attention, certainly not as much attention as we see in traditional search results. There's also an ad here, but the ad too is pushed down to the bottom. It's not given as much attention. There aren't as many ads as what we would see in a traditional search result. And just for one other idea of what generative AI responses to search could look like, here's Perplexity's answer engine response. And so Perplexity doesn't call themselves a search engine, right? They call themselves an answer engine, but they're essentially doing the same thing as a search engine, and they're a way to be able to get answers to questions. So if you haven't played around with Perplexity yet, tested that out, definitely suggest giving it a try because it gives you a different way of thinking about how search results could end up looking. So in this case, the emphasis really is on the answer, and they're giving you the answer in lots of different formats. You have the text that's in there, you have the map, you have images that are in there. And then with Perplexity, they have the different sources of information put at the top of the screen. And those are given a little bit more attention than what we saw from Bing or what we saw from Google. But they're not given nearly as much attention as what we see in traditional search results. So we've got the three links that are in there, and then a lot more of the links are in that View More box. And on mobile, all the links are pushed into that View More box. So the main takeaways here is that this is really putting the emphasis on a generated response. The links are not given as much attention as what we see in traditional search. And there's some other terms that come up along with SGE that I think you should just be familiar with. There's nobody who's really settled on what the right term is to describe this generative AI integration into search yet. So some people refer to it as SGE, using Google's terminology for this. Others just refer to it as generative AI. Some people refer to this as conversational AI. Some people call this chat search or chatbot search, really emphasizing that follow-up question aspect. of this. And some people refer to it as large language models or LLMs. I'll talk more about what an LLM here is in a few minutes. But the LLM is basically that underlying technology that the generative AI system is using to create that response. And with all of these, people can also put the word optimization behind this. So generative AI optimization or conversational AI optimization or GAIO, CAIO, or large language model optimization, LLMO, to describe the process of optimizing for these different models. So lots of different terms that you might hear, all basically kind of describing the same thing. How do we integrate generative AI into search results? And I think as you start looking at those screenshots and as you start seeing these responses, you get an intuitive sense of this is different than traditional search. And you can start to see how it's going to disrupt traditional search and be very different and create a different kind of experience than what we're used to. But it can be sometimes hard to figure out, how do we quantify this? How do we talk about this? And what is it that's really going on here? And we need to be able to do that, right? We need to be able to talk about this, to be able to come up with the strategies, to be able to come up with the ways that we're going to need to adjust how we approach SEO going forward. So, one of the best ways that we've found to understand the differences and really discuss those differences between traditional search and generative AI search is by thinking about the information seeking process. So, information seeking is just a process for describing how we answer questions. And it can be everything from really simple questions all the way up to very complicated, involved research project type questions, right? And everything in between. So there's lots of different theories describing information seeking. Many of them predate the internet, go back to library sciences and how people sought out information in academia. But those have been adapted and applied to search engines, to websites as we know them today. And we can start adapting these information seeking processes to generative AI as well. So while there's lots of different theories, there's lots of different ways of describing information seeking. At its core, it comes down to three main steps of the process. People have to find a list of information sources. So you ask a question, you say, okay, where am I going to find a list of potential places that could answer this question? So what are all the websites out there that could answer that question for me? Then, once you find that list of information sources, you have to evaluate those sources. You have to say, okay, which of those sources are actually good, or which of those sources are worthwhile, or helpful, or up to date, or current? Which of those sources can I actually use to potentially answer my question? Then, after we've evaluated those sources, we have to go through all the sources we've picked out and said these seem worthwhile, and we have to extract the information that seems like it will answer our question. And we have to aggregate all the different information contained in those sources to be able to find the answer to our question. So find, evaluate, and aggregate are the three main steps of the process. And when you think about traditional search engines, they really help with that first step of the process. They help us find that list of information sources, right? That's what search engines have always done, right? They've returned that list of the 10 blue links. That's what the 10 blue links are, right? It's a list of sources that seem like they're related to your search query. To a certain extent, search engines also help with the evaluation process as well, where they'll filter out some of the spam, some of the junk, some of the stuff that isn't maybe as relevant. Google's not perfect on this, but they're at least helpful with that evaluation process. But when it comes to traditional search, most of the evaluation work is on us. We have to open up those websites. We have to look at those and make our own determinations if it's good or not. Yeah, Google's going to help us a little, but the bulk of that evaluation, that's on us. And then all the aggregation work, going through those sources, reading that information, trying to pull out the pieces of information that are going to actually help us answer our question, that's all on us as well. So search engines help speed up the information seeking process, but a lot of the work of seeking out information, that's on us to complete that process. Generative AI, this is all different because with generative AI, they help with all three steps. With generative AI, you don't see a list of information sources. You don't have to evaluate that list of information sources. They just give you the aggregated answer. And what generative AI is doing when they're training their LLMs and they're going through and learning how all things work and all the different patterns as part of their training process, they're doing the find work. They're doing the evaluation work for us. So that way, when we're engaging with generative AI, we go straight from asking our question to getting the answer. We get that aggregated response. So that really speeds up the information seeking process. And as a result, people don't have to click to websites. They don't have to open up a bunch of different things and look at stuff. They can go straight to the answer. And that's a problem if you have a business model that depends on people going to your website, because they may not need to if generative AI can just give them the aggregated answer. But there's a couple other things to keep in mind too about that aggregated answer that generative AI is giving you that make it even different than what we would typically think of in the information seeking process that we're used to. And first off, is that aggregation process can be highly personalized. So with a search query or with websites, right, they're typically geared toward lots of different people typing in the same search query or lots of people seeing the same page on a website, right? But with an aggregated response, you can tweak your prompt so that way you get an aggregated answer that's specific to your particular needs, your particular way of approaching this question. So generative AI not only gets you quicker to the answer, but it gets you quicker to a better answer than websites or search engines are currently able to do so. And then the other thing that's important to keep in mind about the aggregation stage of this process is generative AI tools are able to aggregate information across way more sources than anybody's really going to be able to go to, right? Even if you have a really important question that you need to answer, you're going to open, a few different websites, look at a few different things. You're going to go through and, maybe look at, say, a dozen or a couple dozen at most sources. Generative AI is going to look at hundreds or thousands or millions of different sources. They're going to look at everything that exists about that. So there again, we can see that not only is generative AI taking over the entire information seeking process and getting you to that answer more quickly, but they're getting you to a much better answer than search engines are able to do so currently. And the main thing to remember here is people don't really want to use a search engine. They don't really want to visit a website. People don't really want to converse with generative AI tools, right? They don't want to do any of this stuff. What all of us want is we just want to get answers to our questions. We just want to get the information that we're seeking, and we want to get it as quickly as possible. So currently, the best way we can get information is to use search engines and websites and some combination to get answers. But if generative AI is able to give pretty accurate answers to our questions, people are going to switch over to using generative AI. And so that's why generative AI starts to pose such a big threat to SEO as we currently know it and websites as we currently understand them, because it's getting people to the thing that they actually want, getting people to information in a much faster way than we've ever had before. So that's one way of understanding the difference between traditional search and generative AI. But another way we can start to understand these differences is to think about the underlying technology and how the underlying tech really differs between these two systems. Because truth be told, traditional search and generative AI are very different things. And so much of how we approach SEO right now, how much of we think about SEO and the SEO process is based around how search engines work, right? What search engines are actually doing. And so we're going to have to change our mindsets, our approach to be based around how generative AI systems work. And there's a lot of differences within that. So it's important to understand how these technologies are different from each other. So at a high level, search engines have three main processes that they go through, right? The first thing search engines have to do is they have to go out and crawl the web, and they have to look at all the different websites. Then they bring all the information that they found when crawling the web into their own databases, and they have to organize those databases, and they have to figure out, okay, how do we actually put everything together? And we have to make evaluations about things. We have to make determinations about what's good and what's not good. And Google's obviously passing all of their algorithms through all that information to make those determinations. And from all those determinations, they build an index or a really complicated database of all those different information sources, right? And then they can pull on that index and draw information out of that index to return rankings. So everything with search engines really is about that index, about that database of information. In contrast with an LLM, which is the underlying model behind generative AI, there is no database of information, right? There's no database that they're drawing on. Instead, how LLMs work is they're a neural network, and a neural network is a collection of nodes. So you can see in this diagram, there's all these little circles. All those circles represent nodes, and those nodes are organized into different layers, and they're connected in different ways. So all the black lines are the connections between those nodes. How the layers work, how the connections work, That's not stuff I'm going to get into here today. It's stuff that's interesting, and I would definitely encourage you to learn more about that if you're interested. But the gist of it is that when LLMs are trained, they adjust how all these nodes are connected so that way they can better understand patterns in the training material. So what they're looking for in that training material is not trying to extract information, not trying to pull out facts or figures like Google might be doing when they're trying to organize information. But what an LLM is trying to do is they're trying to learn patterns of how words work together. And the reason they're learning those patterns is that way they can make accurate predictions about what words to use in the generated response. So that single circle off to the side on the right, all by itself, that dark blue one, that's the prediction that they're making. So it's passed in all this information, and then the LLM is trained so they can make a really accurate prediction about what words to use. So as an example here, let's say you ask a question, what color is the sky? A search engine is going to go and they're going to query their index and they're going to try and find information sources, websites that can answer that question. They're going to retrieve those information sources, those websites, and they're going to present those back to you and say, here's potential websites that could answer that question. You pass an LLM the question, what color is the sky? They don't do that, right? They don't go and they don't try and figure out, oh, okay, what pieces of information, what websites do I have that could answer that question? Instead, what an LLM is going to do is it's going to go through all those different nodes in the network, and it's going to try and figure out, okay, what pattern have I learned so that I can answer this question? So if it's fed the prompt, what color is the sky? It's going to go through and it's going to say, okay, based on all these different patterns that I've learned, I'm going to make a prediction that the word I should say is blue. And it's going to make that prediction and output that piece of information, not because it's actually been trained to know that, but because it's been trained on the patterns that get it to a point where it can predict that. So there's a real difference in goals between what a search engine is doing and what a generative AI system is doing. Search engines are all about trying to organize information in such a way that they can accurately retrieve relevant information in response to a query. In contrast, an LLM is all about learning patterns that exist in the language so that way it can generate a pretty coherent, pretty intelligent response to a prompt using those patterns. So one is based on retrieval and one is based on generation. And if we think about this in context of information seeking, it starts to make sense why there's such a dramatic difference in how they approach the information seeking process. Because with search engines, by definition, they're trying to retrieve relevant information sources, right? They're by definition focused on that fine step of the information seeking process. LLMs, generative AI, they're focused on that aggregate step of the information seeking process, right? They're trying to generate an aggregated response that brings together all the different patterns that they know about words to respond to that question. And that's why, as we shift toward a more generative, aggregated response to the information seeking process, there is going to be a pretty massive change to how we think about SEO and how we need to think about our websites and how we need to think about how we're going to actually construct online businesses going forward from here. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about how this changes our SEO strategies and where we need to begin. The place to really get started right now is we need to gauge impact. We need to understand how this is going to affect things. And there's three main questions that we need to go through and look at to understand what kind of impact this could have on our companies and on our SEO performance that we are currently looking at. So the first question that we need to answer is whether or not SGE is present for our top queries. Is it even showing up in our search results or not? Next question we need to figure out is whether or not our website shows up in that SGE response. And then lastly, we need to figure out, okay, we show up in the SGE response, but does that matter? Will people click to our website? Will people actually try and come to our website from that SGE response like they do from traditional search? Or if they don't click, what kind of value could we expect from that SGE listing? So let's go through these in more detail, starting off with the first question, whether SGE is present for your top queries or not. So there's lots of different studies that have been done looking at how prominent SGE is, where it's showing up, how it's showing up. This one that we happen to pull in here is from Bright Edge Labs, and its findings are very similar to a lot of the other studies. There's been a lot of consistency, and the consistent answer is SGE shows up a lot. So in this particular study, only 15% of the queries evaluated did not contain some type of SGE response. All the other ones did. And they broke it out with different types of SGE responses. An opt-in response means people had to click a button to generate the response to the query. They had to click a button to see the SGE result. 16% of people saw a collapsed version of SGE, meaning they saw a part of it, but then had to click to expand. I wouldn't get too hung up on, oh, it's an opt-in, it's collapsed, or it's this other format. Google is experimenting with this. They're still trying to figure out the best way to incorporate this into search results. Google also knows that people aren't as familiar with SGE yet. So as more people become more familiar with SGE, and as Google understands better how people want to see SGE, the format's going to change. Maybe it will be more opt-in, maybe it'll be more collapse, maybe it'll be something that we're not even thinking about today. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the format of it. I'd focus more initially on, does SGE even show up in some form or another? Because if it's showing up in some form or another, that's going to be a place that Google's going to experiment with. They're going to try other things. So SGE may not be very prominent today on that search result, but it might be more prominent in the future. And the question that you need to really understand is, well, is SGE even showing up right now or not? And just really underscoring that Google is experimenting with this. They are looking at different things. They're still very much trying to figure out how SGE is going to work. They're just now starting to test this outside of people who have explicitly opted in to seeing SGE. So currently, the only people who saw SGE were people who went to Google Search Labs and turned that feature on and opted in. But now Google's going to try rolling this out for everybody and experimenting with where this is at. So that's why I said, don't get too hung up on what SGE looks like today. Just really focus on, does SGE show up in some way on our search results? And you want to know which search results SGE is showing up on currently, so we can start to understand which queries might potentially be the ones that could be disrupted going forward. So the next question to start looking at is whether your website is in the SGE response or not. And there's other studies that have been done around this. The one we pulled in here found that 20% of SGE links matched the links that were contained on the first page of Google's traditional search results. So not a lot of overlap between the two. And it makes sense if you think about the differences in the underlying technology between these two systems, right? A traditional search result is trying to retrieve information from the database, and it's using its algorithms to figure out, okay, which is the best result contained in this database that I should return in response to this query. The LLM is just looking at different patterns in the language and saying, oh, okay, based on the patterns I've learned, this seems like the relevant source that I should return for this particular query. So very different approaches to things, and that difference in retrieval versus patterns that are used to generate a response is going to change what kind of websites show up in here. So we're not going to see a lot of overlap between those, which means that if you have a query that you show up for right now, and it's one of your really top terms, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to show up in the SGE result. And somebody else might be showing up in that SGE result. You need to understand that. You need to understand that your website isn't showing up, and you need to start shifting your optimization strategies to, continue supporting the traditional result, make sure you show up there, but also find ways to show up in the SGE result as well. But the other reason that your website may not show up in the SGE result is that the intent changed with what the SGE result is looking at, what kind of websites it's even going to show in there. So this example of a query is looking at best energy efficient dishwasher, right? And on the left, we have a traditional search result, and we have Energy Star that shows up, and Consumer Reports, and Best Buy that shows up. And further down the page, there were more review websites talking about other types of best dishwashers and evaluating those kind of like Consumer Reports. That's very different than what we see in the SGE result on the right side of the screen, right? When we do best energy efficient dishwasher for an SGE result, very different websites come back. We've got Frigidaire coming back, we've got Maytag coming back, and then not included in the screenshot, but further down the page, we have other direct manufacturer websites coming up here as well. So you need to look at these SGE responses, and if the intent has changed, determine whether that intent change presents an opportunity for you or presents a problem for you. And depends on what website you are as you look at this difference. If you're Frigidaire's website, your Maytag's website, it's good news for you. You're showing up in SGE, you might actually get traffic. for this term where you haven't necessarily gotten that traffic before. So that's good news. That's an opportunity for them. If you're Best Buy ranks pretty highly for the traditional search results, but they don't show up in the SG response. However, Home Depot shows up in the SG response. That's a website like theirs, right? And there's some similarities. So maybe with some work, Best Buy could show up in the SG response as well. So there's maybe an opportunity presented for them. So for Best Buy, this is a possibility. But if you're Consumer Reports or you're a website like Consumer Reports, there's nothing showing up like that in SGE. So this might be one that's a lost term. And you need to understand that. You need to understand that this may not be a term that's reliable for your website to show up or to get traffic in the future. And you need to adjust your strategy accordingly to focus on the terms where you can show up, not the terms where you could potentially lose out on traffic in the future. The last question to think about is, okay, you figured out which SGE terms you could show up in, and you somehow managed to show up in those SGE responses with a link. Great. What does that do for you? Will people click on that link or not? So if we look at an informational search query like population demographics of Brazil, on the traditional results over on the left side of the screen, we've got Statista, we've got Wikipedia, we've got the CIA World Factbook. They're coming up. And I would almost have to click on one of those in the traditional search result to be able to answer my question, right? There's just not enough information provided in the traditional search. So I would have to go to those websites to get an answer to my question. In the case of SGE, my answer is right there, right? We're already jumping to that aggregate stage of the information seeking process. I've got all the information pulled in. I've got percentages. I've got different breakouts. I've got a lot of details provided that probably answer my question. Maybe I would still need to click on something if I really wanted something else. But for the most part, this is probably going to satisfy a lot of people's questions in response to this. And that's true for a lot of informational queries. So even though CIA World Factbook shows up, probably not going to get a lot of clicks from this particular query, right? Because why would people need to click? Do they need that much additional information here or not? So this is why, right? That Gartner study that I'm sure all of you have heard about, kind of everywhere when it came out, is predicting that organic search traffic will decrease 50% or more by 2028. Other people have challenged this and said, no, 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 it'll be a much smaller drop. People will still, have lots of organic search traffic. Some people have said it'll be a much bigger percentage. Other people have quibbled with the timeline. No, it will take until, the 2030s until we see that kind of drop, or, no, it'll happen a lot faster because people will move to it more quickly. Whether the timeline is different, whether the percentage is different, I think the main takeaway is that organic search traffic is going to change and probably going to be reduced, certainly for certain types of queries. And with that in mind, Andrea and I did a study last month looking at how people's click behavior will change on different SGE responses. So we showed about a couple hundred people, different SGE responses, and asked them whether or not they would see a need to click on those links contained in the SGE response or not. And you can see that for different types of queries, the answers changed. For transactional queries, where people are pretty much ready to make a purchase, kind of like that best energy efficient dishwasher one that we were looking at, that's transactional, right? People are more inclined to click, right? 62% of people said, yeah, still click on that one. 21% said maybe. So, there's pretty good chance that transactional terms could still get some traffic. On the flip side, informational terms, only 56% of people said they would for sure click, and a full 28% of people said they would not click. And this is early days. This is before people are actually really familiar with what SGE is, and before we've really seen the full potential of what SGE can do or what SGE responses are going to look like. So right now already we're starting to see that there's not a lot of people clicking on certain types of search terms. So as you start thinking about where you need to put your focus on optimizing for SGE and optimizing for the new world of search, you want to try and focus on the terms that are potentially going to get you some kind of traffic. And it might not be the kinds of terms that you are currently getting traffic from today. And so with that in mind, the biggest thing that you need to start doing right now is you need to assess your search queries. You need to go through and you need to pull all of your top search queries, whether it's from Google Search Console or Ahrefs or SEMrush or wherever you have those, or better yet, probably all the different sources, and figure out, okay, what are my top search queries right now today? Where am I actually deriving value from search today? And then you need to go through and check if SGE is present. Is SGE potentially going to threaten that high ranking term or not? And if SGE is not present for some of your terms, then those are terms that you need to really defend and you need to really go after. And you make sure that you are really going to maintain your position in traditional search results. But if SGE is showing up for any of those terms, then you need to figure out whether your website is showing up in that SGE response or not, whether a competitor website or a website like yours is showing up in that SGE response, or if that SGE response has really shifted away and the intent has changed where a website like yours may not actually be able to show up. And then you also need to be able to figure out whether or not people are going to click on those search queries or not, even if your website happened to show up in the SGE response. And so by going through and looking at these different questions, you can start to figure out, okay, what's defensible in the future? What is defensible in traditional search where SGE may not show up? And what is something that I'm going to have to put effort and energy into optimizing for with SGE so that way I can try and get clicks from there and try and defend those search terms in the SGE response. And while we're talking about this in terms of SGE, and that's Google's term, I would definitely recommend you look at these same questions on Bing to understand what Copilot is doing, not necessarily because there's going to be a lot of traffic there, but just to give you a different perspective on where the threats might exist or where the opportunities might exist. And same goes for looking at Perplexity's responses as well. Again, not because there's necessarily going to be a lot of traffic there, but just to get a better sense of what kinds of terms might present an opportunity for you in the future. So if you want, you can download this table as a spreadsheet at elementive.com/SGE prepare. That'll take you to a Google Drive file that contains this. And you can start answering these questions for yourself and for your own website. Obviously, if you have questions about that or want help going through that, Andrea and I are happy to help you with that. So feel free to reach out or contact us. But the main takeaway here should be you need to start figuring out right now, like which search queries are the ones that are going to work for you in the new world of SEO. So with that, we have some time left here this morning and definitely want to get to any and all questions that you have. Andrea, do we have any questions that have come in yet?
Don't have any questions from participants today, so if you do have any, please feel free to drop those in chat. But a few questions that we get commonly asked as this technology and things just start to really evolve and change in the search landscape are one, are there any like technical changes that websites should be making now to make sure that these SGEs can get to all their content? Is it any different than the strategies that we use for websites today?
It's similar to the strategies we use today. And I think the biggest thing that you need to think about is whether or not you allow certain bots in to see your content or not. A lot of people have said, I'm going to block ChatGPT, or I'm going to block, Claude, or I'm going to block Anthropic, block these other systems, or block certain parts of Google looking at my website. And there's reasons for that. Maybe you want to block it to protect copyright. Maybe you want to block that to defend your IP. But by blocking it, you're not going to necessarily be able to show up in these responses. So that's one of the big things that you need to grapple with is whether you allow these bots in or not. I would say the other technical change to think about is whether or not you have things structured in a way that AI tools will actually understand your content. Do you have the right entities used in your content? Are you talking about the terms in a way that generative AI systems will be able to get what your content's talking about or not? So there's maybe some content related things that you could shift and change to as well.
Another one related to, obviously there's different keyword intents with transactional, commercial, informational. Do you think this will change by industry?
For sure. And you can already see, Google is changing how SGE shows up based on the different industries. Like you look at financial, maybe SGE isn't showing up quite as much there. Healthcare, it's not showing up quite as much there. But certainly when it comes to e-commerce or retail, we do see SGE showing up more and more places. It's also interesting to look at what Perplexity is doing with this, because Perplexity is showing search results. Obviously, they show answers for all different topics, all different queries, but the kinds of information they're bringing in are pretty different. But than what we see, maybe showing up in other types of answers. So by looking at Perplexity, you can start to understand some of those differences in the kinds of answers they're bringing in based on the different industries. And I would expect that, is probably going to be the case as Google rolls this out. There's certain industries that SG presents, more trouble because it can provide inaccurate information. Obviously, it's more of a problem if it provides inaccurate information in certain industries than it does in other industries. And I think Google is aware of that. They want to avoid lawsuits. So they're going to probably be careful with rolling it out to certain industries. But when you start thinking about, assessing impact and assessing the way in which this could affect your business, I think it's important to assume that it could eventually roll out to everything and to any type of industry.
Randy, thank you for posting a few questions. First one, what's your take on timing for rollout?
Google is experimenting with it right now. I mean, they are, trying to roll this out to more and more people, right? They're, expanding this beyond, just people who have specifically opted in. Bing obviously has already rolled this out. Like everybody can see these types of responses on Bing. And my guess, I mean, Google hasn't said what their actual timeline is, but my guess would be that, Google is going to start carefully with this. But if they see promising results with the initial rollout, with more people seeing it, my guess is we could start to see this roll out much more quickly. Gartner study, kind of forecasted that it would be a kind of a 4-year rollout for it to kind of reach peak levels, where you start to see the most impact, with kind of a noticeable change sometime in the next couple of years, was what they found. So, somewhere between 2 to 4 years is what Gartner's kind of thinking. And I think when you think about how other technologies rolled out, including search back in the day, Google, it's always been a bit of a slow build, and then it's just kind of everywhere and it explodes. And I think my question becomes, when's that tipping point where it rolls out just enough where everybody is more comfortable with it and rolls it out. So, I think Gartner's study, probably in the next couple of years, probably makes the most sense as a rough timeline to think about. But it could definitely end up being a lot faster if Google gets more promising results as they start showing SGE to more people.
One last question for today. Will NLP be a factor since LLMs are trained to output answers based on specific word patterns?
Yeah, I mean, all the LLMs are definitely, an outgrowth of natural language processing. And so I think how you want to maybe approach optimizing your website or thinking about optimizing your website is to understand more about natural language processing and understand, how those systems, work. But definitely, those LLMs are definitely an outgrowth of natural language processing that's been worked on for the last several decades, and on all the work that's been done with that. In particular, I would say too with NLP, think about using NLP systems to understand entities and understand how to extract, what is this talking about? What is this topic that I'm looking at, and what are those particular things I'm talking about in the topic? And that's what entity analysis can do. I think that's the other place that could be really beneficial to use from a standpoint of how do you optimize for these systems by leveraging a lot of those technologies. It doesn't have to be the most sophisticated NLP. Even if you go to some very rudimentary NLP libraries, they can help you with entity extraction or trying to compare different documents or understand topics or look at those kinds of things, or understand if words are written in a way that more advanced LL systems will actually be able to understand them. I think that could be a really important tool that we'll all end up needing to use and understand better as we try to optimize our websites going forward.
Good question and answer. Well, with that, if you have any other questions as you kind of process all this information and think through what we've shared, please feel free to reach out to us and send us those questions. We want to hear them from you. As well, we're going to continue doing some of these webinars each month focused on SGE as well as other topics important to the SEO space and the work we all do. So look for those emails, and we hope that you'll sign up for our series of webinars coming up. And again, here's our contact information. We'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn if we aren't already, or please feel free again to reach out to us if you have any questions on the information we shared today. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you just have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.